Well, welcome everyone to our session this afternoon on what's behind the behavior. I'm Gosztonyi. I'm a psychologist and the coordinator of the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management. And I have my co-coordinator with me, Catherine Cora. You want to say hi, Catherine?
Hello, everybody. Welcome.
Great. So this session here is one that is kind of a background session. So it allows us, what we're hoping here is to provide some background to some of the things that that we've talked about in the number of our different presentations, and which really provides kind of the underpinnings to why we make the suggestions that we make, how we look at behavior. As humans, it's very complex. It's not a simple thing to do. And so we're going to do a quick run through of those the factors that go behind the behavior. Um, and really, why do we need to know that? Well, the thing is that what we see on the outside is really telling us something about what is happening on the inside. I was trained as a psychologist in the day when there was huge debates between what we call depth psychology, so the people that were thinking about what was going on inside of the psyche, and the behaviorists who basically said it's all on the outside, and we're just going to look at what we can see, and then kind of in between the learning theorists. But luckily, the neuroscience has come in and has basically told us we can't ignore what's going on inside. And we have to really respect and understand what's going on inside. It's not simply a question of training the brain. The brain has lots of things that are already ready to go and ready to get wired together. So it's really important that we understand what's happening within us as human beings. And really, what we see does influence what we do. And that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on seeing some behaviors that schools will find challenging and just seeing what is underneath it. And if we see it differently, what kind of an influence can it have on our interventions? And many of the interventions, or some of the interventions that I know I used to suggest many years ago before I understood about the emotional world and the neuroscience, really did not deal with what the problem was. And so what we want to do here is really understand what's behind the behavior so that we can choose interventions that will make a difference. Sometimes we do interventions and they make a difference for a very short time. It doesn't generalize. And so it gets frustrating. And also, we have to avoid interventions that risk making things worse. I love my Calvin and Hobbes. Students with challenging behaviors are just trying to tell us that they need us to help them. And Bill Watterson, who sadly is no longer drawing Calvin and Hobbes, got it. He nailed it right there. I'm in a crabby mood, so everyone just leave me alone. I hate everyone. Nobody recognizes my hints to smother me with affection. And this is really what we're talking about here. We use the developmental approach, the developmental paradigm that was developed by Dr. Gordon Neufeld, some very basic things, keys that if we understand these keys, they make a huge difference in our understanding of behavior. The first one is the maturation key, and now especially that we have 4-year-olds in our schools, truly understanding what a 4-year-old is compared to even a 5-year-old, let alone a 6-year-old, and then all the way up through adolescence. Maturation is a process. It unfolds in a certain way. In human beings, it takes a very long time to kind of stabilize, not well into the mid-20s. And so we need to truly locate ourselves or situate ourselves in terms of where is this particular student in terms of their overall maturation, just chronologically, but then also we know that some kids get stuck in their maturation. And maturation is a natural process. We don't need to pull on the plant. We don't need to do things to make the maturation happen. It's a natural process. But one of the conditions which we know is essential for growth is softness. We can't have the shell on the seed for the seed to be able to grow and develop. Well, when we're soft, we're vulnerable. And vulnerability is a difficult state to tolerate. But without that softness, you can't have the growth. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through today. What is it that allows us as human beings to tolerate the vulnerability that we need in order to grow and develop? That is the attachment key. And that is what we as adults in the lives of children, that's one of our main roles, is to keep the child feeling safe enough so that they then can be soft and vulnerable and they can grow. And underlying all of this is a very, very rich emotional world. And as you all know that because you're in classrooms with children, you've got lots of emotions going on, and we need to truly understand emotions, how they work, and how they tie into attachment, vulnerability, and maturation. So we're going to just consider what emotions are, and they are no long they were considered for the longest time kind of stuff that was there that was kind of keeping us from being who we should be. But actually, we now know that emotions serve a very, very important purpose. Many, many purposes. Of course, we like our emotions of joy and happiness. These are things that provide pleasure for us, to make our life, we look forward to our lives. But they are the other ones, even the emotions that are a little bit harder to understand, are there for a good reason. And the thing we need to understand about emotions is that they have what we call an action potential. So in other words, once they are activated, they have to move forward and actually find a way out. For those of us that live in northern climes here in North America, and maybe a little bit less so now because we don't have so many carpets around, but in the olden days when there were lots of carpets, we saw this with static electricity. It gathered in us as we walked across a carpet, only to manifest itself when we went to turn on the light switch. It came in, but it had to find a way out. And emotions are exactly like that. So when we look at what's happening in terms of the behaviors that we see, especially the ones that are of concern to us, and we have the ones that are related to anxiety and obsessions and agitation, and then we have the aggression, the hitting, the tantrums. We have even being resistant and not wanting to do things, or being depressed. These are the behaviors that we're most concerned about. They are the external manifestation of a very rich experiential and emotional world. And when we're looking at especially the behaviors that are concerning to us, we know that they are linked to things like separation, trauma, loss, even sensory issues, and alarm, which is a big emotion, and frustration, which is another big emotion. And we'll talk about those in a moment. Now, of course, in our experiential and emotional world, we also have love, joy, sadness, all sorts of other ones. But what we're going to focus on today are when this experiential and emotional world bursts out into behaviors that are difficult for us to handle or to understand. And we're going to try and look at the origins of that and why that happens. And then, of course, what we can do about it, at least introduce what we can do about it. One of the things that I think we have all come to understand, and this talk is being given in 2022, in the second year now of a global pandemic, where we have been sadly asked to separate ourselves from even the people that we love the most. And we need to recognize, and I'm sure we've all recognized that and felt that one of the things that affects us the most is actually facing separation, the experiencing or facing the lack of or the loss of closeness to those to whom we are attached. We maybe never even thought about it very much until we were told we couldn't do that anymore. And it's been really difficult, really, really difficult, because actually, as human beings, togetherness ensures our survival. We live in especially here in North America, we live in a climate that's very difficult, but all of our climates have their challenges. Our children are dependent upon us. They're not capable of basically running their own lives until well into their teens and early 20s. Without each other, we would not survive. And therefore, we are wired with instincts, attachment instincts, that are very sensitive to any hint of separation. Now, with the children in our schools, we know that many of them have had experiences of separation, and we need to be aware of them. We need to be sensitive to them. Sometimes we can become overwhelmed by them because we know how difficult it is for the child. But we have to understand that when a child is having a separation experience, it is really hard for them to focus on what's happening in school. So one of the things that happen are things like the birth of a sibling, parents not getting along, parents absent for periods of time, parents not living together, and not especially when they're not getting along. If the family has a sibling or the child has a sibling who's ill or with special needs, now the parents are focused on that child and not so much on all of the other children in the family. A parent getting a new partner, a parent having multiple partners. So, with having a new partner, the child often wonders, am I going to still be loved? With multiple partners, is my parent going to leave next? Separation from biological parents, either through foster care or adoption, very important. There's huge impacts of a child, especially foster care, but even for adoptive children about the separation experiences that they have. And then adverse family conditions. The ACEs study or trauma has let us understand that when children live in very stressful, difficult circumstances, that they are constantly experiencing separation through that. And obviously, if a parent becomes ill, or even in the case that a parent dies. So these are all experiences that will affect the children in your care. And so what happens when we're facing separation? Well, the brain is moved to fix the problem. That is why the emotions are there. Emotion means to move. And Dr. Neufeld, when he studied the emotions around separation, he identified three main ones, and he's not the only person who's identified them. There are many researchers now that are studying one or other or a couple of these. Dr. Neufeld has actually put them all together, which is somewhat interesting. And the three main reactions that we have to facing separation, one is pursuit, move to restore proximity. If you haven't heard from somebody, they were supposed to call you, especially if they were on a trip and they were supposed to call you to tell you that they arrived safely. And if they haven't, well, most of us would reach out. We'd text. We'd find some way to get in touch with them. Are you okay? Children do that. They'll promise to be good for us because they don't want to be separated by what they've done. And so pursuit is a very natural, normal response. And when we get the reaction, no, it's okay. Yes, I'm fine. Then we can relax. Sometimes facing separation will cause us to experience the emotion of alarm, because alarm will move us to caution and to avoid that which alarms. And so if I text my husband and ask him, are you okay? And he writes back and says, stop texting me, I'll tell you when I'm fine. Oops, now I go into alarm. Okay, I'm going to be very careful now not to text too often, because that possibly could break the relationship. And then the third emotion is frustration, where we are moved to effect change to fix the problem. And it might well be that when he comes back from his trip, I'm going to let him know kind of what I need from him in order to keep the relationship going. And do you think you don't have to text me a whole sentence, just text me a little emoji to let me know that you're still around? And frustration is a very useful emotion because, let's face it, without frustration, we wouldn't have had some of the vaccines and some of the changes that we've made in terms of dealing with the pandemic that we're involved with right now. Very, very important emotion. So when an emotion starts, it basically comes from the limbic system, and it moves us in ways that serve our survival. And the amygdala is kind of like our smoke detector. Oops, there's trouble. I haven't heard from this person. Oh, they don't look very happy with me. Although even the nonverbal behaviors, it doesn't have to be verbal. I remember my daughter looking at me and say, Mommy, why are you upset with me? Well, I wasn't upset with her. I was just thinking about the shopping list I had to do. But she saw that as being upset. And so the amygdala checks out. And when the amygdala senses that there's danger, it connects with the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus basically says, all right, body, you got to get going. You got to do something to fix the situation. And these are also linked to the hippocampus, which remembers the things that could be of danger to us, but also remembering that the hippocampus is involved with learning and putting things from short-term memory into long-term memory. Some of the children in your care will go home and They'll come back the next day. It's as if they hadn't learned, or couldn't remember what it is they had just learned the day before. And that could well be that they didn't have enough rest that night for the hippocampus to do its job, because when the hippocampus is involved with survival, it cannot do its job in terms of passing things from short-term memory into long-term memory. And of course, the hypothalamus basically says, all right, sympathetic nervous system, let's get going, and pumps cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, growth hormone into the system so that we can get done what needs to get done. And it affects our blood vessels, our rest and digest, our heart rate, because the blood diverts to the muscles. And it allows us to figure out what to do, to be ready to do the next thing. Do I need to try and change something? Do I need to try and fix the relationship? Do I need to pull back? It gets us ready to do what we need to do. The thing about emotion, of course, is that it should be going up and down. And of course, what we know now in the pandemic that we've lived through is we've all been in a heightened state of emotion. And of course, when our cortisol and adrenaline systems are overworked, it can cause a lot of fatigue. And it can also cause memory problems because we're focusing on how to stay safe rather than being able to remember all the things that we have to do. So, what's really interesting here is that these primary emotions are usually intense and usually felt one at a time. And what happens is that they can displace one another, but they are still there. So what sometimes happens is that they will be expressed not at that time, but at another time and place. So let me just give you a couple of examples. One, for example, is that any of you have lost your child in the mall. You will remember, like when you notice that your little 4-year-old is no longer with you, you're going to go into pursuit and alarm. You are going to try and do everything you can to find your child. And you think to yourself, oh, I'm going to be so happy when I find her. I'm just going to give her the biggest hug and just tell her how much I love her. Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but when that happened to me and I finally did find my daughter and gave her the hug, the next thing that came out of my mouth was, what were you thinking? Because frustration was there. I wanted her to figure out how not to run away and get lost. So they do get displaced. Another example of that are some children are very good at school through pursuit and alarm, and it's not because anybody's mean to them. They just hold it all together. But when they get home, all the frustrations of the day come out. And they can often have a meltdown for the tiniest little reason because they have gathered their frustration together. So we need to be aware that these emotions spiral around, they can displace one or another, and it can be quite confusing sometimes. Well, where did that come from? Pursuit, we don't often worry too much about because children who are in pursuit usually try and please us. They're the ones that when we give them the look, they go, okay, and they'll try and be good for us. We see some difficulties with children who get caught in too much pursuit. The ones who are constantly seeking attention, who are always wanting to be first, always wanting to win, always wanting to be the best. Sometimes it'll manifest itself in taking things. People have sometimes asked, this child, why does he steal things? Well, it's a way of kind of, if you can't get get a relationship with a person, you get a relationship with things. And for some children, it comes around to being just too good. And I've often had people say to me, it's not that I don't like having her in my class, but she's always so good. I worry about her. And that it can be a problem, but it usually becomes more of a problem when we go into adulthood. Um, so let's look now. With alarm and frustration, we're going to look at the manifestations of those. So I thought it would be easiest if I looked if I presented a couple of students to you that I ran across in my practice when I was working in schools. So here we have Marie and Jason, siblings living with their mother and father in the country. They travel to school every day by bus for over an hour. Both children have behavioral problems that the school staff are concerned about. Marie tends to be more reactive, yelling at her friends and teachers when things don't go her way. Jason will often run out of the classroom, find a place to hide. Principal tries to get him to talk about what's bothering him, but he won't say anything except he's not going back to class. The mother has struggled with cancer for the past 3 years, going back and forth to the hospital. She's now in remission. The father was out of work while his wife was ill, but now that she's better, he has taken a job in Western Canada and can only be home every few weeks. So what we're looking at here is what's going on? What's behind what there's a problem behavior. I'm going to share some of the problem behaviors these children had. What is going on? And the analysis that I've sort of landed on, and there's many things we can add to this, but this kind of covers the basics for me are, well, when did the behavior happen? Where did it happen? With whom did it happen? What came before? What was a precursor? Were there any warning signs? Were there possible triggers? And are there other factors such as attachment problems, sensitivity problems, vulnerability issues, and immaturity? And as already you can gather a hint from these two children, there are definitely attachment problems there. The mother being ill, the father being away, this can cause all sorts of emotional reactions on the part of the children. And remember, emotions don't compartmentalize themselves. A child who has a frustration alarm or a sort of a separation frustration or a separation alarm comes to school with that. This kind of like they're already up to here with it, and it's going to affect other things that happen in their world. And when we're looking at a problem behavior, what we're going to try and figure out is what's going to be the best way to intervene. Are there things that I can do? Are there places within this circle that I can find a way of intervening that can make a difference to this child? So let's look at frustration. Let's look at frustration and aggression. And let me just tell you about what happened with Marie. So one day the children were playing with shovels in the schoolyard with the melting snow. Within minutes, after Marie got off the bus, she grabbed one of the shovels, hit another child with very little provocation or preamble. So what's happening with her? Well, there's an emotion, frustration. And frustration is the emotion that arises when something is not working. And it's meant to move us to change. And if we can't change something, then we're meant to be changed by it, which we call adaptation. This emotion, of course, is fueled by adrenaline, cortisol, heart rate, blood pressure. It kind of this big oomph that happens. And it's a very strong one. Frustration is one of our strongest emotions. Most of you, I think, have felt that power of frustration. Now, normally, what should happen is we turn it into a feeling that we can express, this isn't working for me, this is frustrating, this needs to change. And just to alert you to the fact that emotion becomes a feeling when it is felt or becomes conscious. It can become conscious. Sometimes some person can say, oh, I'm really frustrated. No, we need to know that they actually identify with that feeling inside of them, like something's got to change. It's a very intense feeling. When we, for whatever reason, can't deal with the amount of emotion that we have inside of ourselves, and I'll tell you in a moment how that works. Our brain protects us against sort of sensing that in a way that kind of numbs us out a bit. And so we have less feeling. But the problem is all of these impulses are there. And this is when they tend to come out in behaviors that we see, like impatience, abruptness, rudeness, irritability, screaming, hitting, fighting, physical outbursts, tantrums, meltdowns. So that adrenaline, cortisol has to go somewhere, and sometimes it goes into these kinds of behaviors. Many times when things can't be changed, the biochemicals of frustration actually can be transformed when we go into sadness and tears. And many of you have heard me talk about that. I won't have a lot of time today to speak about that, but it can be transformed. But it tends to manifest itself in these ways even before that transformation can happen. Why does our brain protect us? Well, we can become overwhelmed by what we feel. We can feel too vulnerable or too wounded. And there are experiences like too much separation, too much shame, too much alarm that overwhelm us. And basically, our brain puts on the shell. And by the way, Bessel van der Kolk in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, has gathered together all sorts of research where they have actually identified and seen the neuroscience of defendedness. This was one of the proposals of Sigmund Freud, and was discounted for many, many years, nearly 100 years. But now the research is saying, nope, the brain actually does do that. But of course, it's meant to do that for a short amount of time and then to go away again. So, there's supposed to be an end of the day when the shell comes down. But for some of our children, they put that shell on and it stays on. It's not safe to depend or feel vulnerable. It's not safe to express what I am feeling. The world is overwhelming and there is no one that can keep me safe. And these, of course, are very much the effects of adverse childhood experiences. So when we look at Marie, we know that there is a lot of frustration inside of her and an inability for her to be able to tell any of us what is going on inside. So let's see what happened here. Let's do the analysis. Hitting with a shovel. Well, when did it happen? After getting off the bus. And remember, she's got an hour and a half or an hour and plus bus ride. So this is going to be a key thought for us when we are looking at what we can do to help her. Where did it happen? It happened in the playground with other children. What came before? Well, she had a long bus ride. And then later on, when they talked to her, she was telling them that some kids were teasing and picking on her the whole way in the bus ride. Were there warning signs? Not really. It happened pretty quickly. She got off the bus, grabbed a shovel, and hit somebody. Um, the trigger, the possible trigger, which she told us later, was that she saw the children laughing and she thought they were laughing at her. And of course, she had to do something. Now, where did all this intense energy, this intense emotion come from? Well, first of all, bus rides are frustrating. She's only 7 years old, which means that her ability to manage her emotions is not that great. And I'll talk a little bit about the brain. But we know that this little girl has a lot of attachment frustration. Her dad is away and her mother has been sick. So when we look at this, now we're going to say to ourselves, what do I really see? And we've got to move from the simplistic idea of this behavior has to stop. I've got to find a way to stop it. I've either got to consequence her so that she learns for her behavior. I've got to perhaps put an incentive system so she stops doing this to do an alternate behavior. Or maybe I'm going to teach her, anger management skills. But really, there's way more going on here. We have to see that it is fueled by frustration. The aggression came from frustration. And really, part of what we need to see is, oh my goodness, she's experiencing too much frustration. Too much is not working in her life. And our job as the adults in children's lives is basically to say, how can I help to reduce frustration, to make things work better for her? What can I do? And remember, this is just a 7-year-old. So we've got to be very much aware of the fact that a 7-year-old brain is not yet ready to manage large, large emotions. That prefrontal cortex that's supposed to do that is not yet, is only starting to kick in and develop. And so we have to be careful because many of the interventions that are normally suggested for children who do these kinds of acting out either through hitting, through screaming, through having meltdowns and tantrums, just actually increase frustration because a consequence is meant to give the child kind of a notice. If you do this, then you can't do that, and that is going to increase frustration. And here's a child who's already overwhelmed by frustration. Timeouts, especially in the sense of you go over there, you think what you've been doing about what you've been doing, and when you're ready to behave, come back, basically just increases attachment frustration because now it is on the child's shoulders to restore the relationship. Some children try to do that, but the children who are overwhelmed by frustration can't keep it up. And so they just increase frustration. Even an incentive system actually displaces frustration with pursuit. Now the child will go after the star, which means that the adults are happy, which means now that they've restored the relationship. But we haven't at all dealt with the frustration, and it's usually going to be displaced to another time or place. Now, what did the school do in this case? Now, I just want to give you a little background information. I actually happened to be at the school that day. It was a small rural school. I had traveled for an entire day to get there. I was there to observe Marie and Jason. And what do I know? I get there and Marie is already being sent home. I mean, it took a while for the mother to come and get her, so I had a chance to see her a little bit and to coach the staff in terms of what they could do. But they did have to suspend her because really, when you take a shovel to another child, you've got to impose a school code of conduct. And you also got to let the other child know and the other children and the parents of the children that we take this kind of behavior very seriously and we're going to protect your children. Um, but while they were waiting for the mother to come, they talked to Marie gently. They knew that there was something going on here. There was much more to this than met the eye. And that was when they found out that she thought that somebody had been teasing her on the bus. And then, because we had been gentle with her and her defenses went down a little bit, she started to get her feelings back. And she told them that she missed her dad. Her dad had just left that day or the night before for a long trip. He wasn't going to be back for 2 weeks. Oh my goodness. What a different way of looking at something that we could see as a very negative behavior, which we don't approve of, but my goodness, there's way more than meets the eye. So what kind of a plan could they have for Marie? Well, the next time that she got to the school, I said to them, we don't know what's happening in her world. We don't know if mom, what happened, if dad forgot to call, if, who knows what's going on. Mom is overwhelmed. She's too tired. Let's just do something that we know makes a lot of sense for these kinds of children. Let's meet her at the bus every morning. And those of you that have heard our presentations know that we call this a check-in. We check to see where she's at. If she seems frustrated, let's take her to a quiet space to talk or to draw. If she's full of attacking energy, let's bring her to the newly created emotions room where we've got a bunch of puppets that she can throw and poo noodles that she can hit with so that she can get out some of that frustration so that we can then lead her back to feeling her feelings and telling us what's going on in her life. Now we have created on our members website, and the link is there, and Catherine will show you at the end how to go and find it, a whole page on understanding frustration and aggression, all sorts of resources. We have a chapter in the Reclaiming Our Students book. We've got a recording of a webinar that we did. There are articles and infographics. We actually have created a placemat that again goes through many of the steps that I've had, what could be going on with that child, what could be done in the classroom, what can be done in other parts of the school, what can be done for these children, where you can really look at and find ideas for interventions. And then you have, if you see the little boxes on there, the green and yellow and pink boxes, where you can find out all sorts of other ways in which to understand about what's happening with children like this, and also have other kinds of interventions that you can do. Alarm and anxiety. Well, let's look at what happened with Jason. On the day that Marie was suspended, and I was there observing, by the way, Jason had a major anxiety attack after lunch. The substitute teacher had asked the students to hand in an assignment that they should have completed that morning. Jason got really, really upset and left the room without asking permission. I had a chance to observe this. I actually saw this, and I was telling Catherine earlier today, it just broke my heart. He paced the hallway. He was muttering to himself, I don't know what's wrong with me. My head is bursting. I must be crazy. I'm an idiot. I'm so stupid. There's something wrong with me. Pulling his hair, waving his hands frantically. This basically was, I think, a panic attack. What do you think, Catherine? Oops.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it does make adults feel uncomfortable to see a child losing control like that, for sure. I mean, the frustration pushes our buttons, but the outburst of the anxiety, it really destabilizes us in a different way.
Yeah. And people are saying, well, he needs a therapist, but this was a small rural community. There was no therapist available. And so again, just so that we remember, this emotion now is alarm. The feeling that comes with alarm are the words, I'm scared. And of course, he had a lot of things to be afraid of, and we'll look in a moment. It's the emotion that arises when something is threatening our attachments, and there was lots of threats in his world to his attachment world. It's meant to move us to be cautious, or to be changed through sadness and tears, or to move through courage. But to move to be changed and to move to courage require that we actually feel our feelings. And so when our brain protects us because there's way too much alarm going on. Now the behaviors come out. Now we have things like the anxiety, the panic attacks, the extreme distress, fears, obsessions, perfectionism, um, compulsions, monsters. Children start seeing things and worrying about things, avoidance, hiding. And this is mostly what Jason did. The principal had called me quite a few months earlier, telling me this is a kid who basically what he does is he runs out of the classroom, Eva, and we're scared he's going to run out of the school. And I said, well, what does he do? He says, well, he runs and hides. I said, okay, well, let's work with that. And I'll tell you what the school ended up doing. But in this particular case, let's just do a quick analysis. So first of all, when did it happen? Well, it happened after lunch. And what occurred to me here was this was a little boy that was holding an awful lot in all the way through until after lunch. It happened in the classroom, but here's the key. It was with a substitute teacher, somebody he didn't know. He clearly had thought in his mind he didn't have the assignment done. What if I hand the assignment to the substitute teacher and the substitute teacher loses it with me? He just couldn't handle that. So he just ran away. So what were the precursors? A substitute teacher. But don't forget, his sister was suspended that morning. Trouble. And there was a stranger observing in the school. At some point, he was actually able to say that. I don't remember whether he yelled it out and looked at me and said, what are you doing here? Or whether he talked to somebody. I can't remember how it is, but it was very clear to me that he was looking at me and wondering what I was doing there. Was I the social worker? Was I going to be taking them away from their home? I mean, there was a lot of stuff that led to him running out of the classroom and having this panic attack. Were there some warning signs? Yep, he was pacing back and forth in the classroom. He was agitated. There was a lot of stuff going on there. And the trigger was asking for work that he had not completed. That was like the thing that put him over the top. But what are the factors? Oh my goodness, too many unknowns. Attachment alarm, dad away, mother sick. There was just so much building up in this little boy. He just couldn't handle it anymore. So again, rather than just, he needs to get out of where he's hiding, he needs to stay in the classroom, we have to see this as being anxiety and alarm. And he's experiencing too much alarm. And what can I do to help reduce the alarm? And again, remember the principal saying, well, should I give him an incentive system for staying in the classroom? But that's not dealing with the alarm. It's just pushing it into another place and it's going to come out somewhere else. And this little boy was so full of it, an incentive system would not have worked with him. So what did the school do? Well, so in that particular moment, luckily the principal was there and he went and talked to Jason. And he basically said to Jason, where do you think you'll feel safe? Because it was unusual that Jason had not run to his little safe place that he normally went to. And they decided in this case it was the computer room because they could close the door. Jason didn't want to talk. He didn't want to have an adult with him. And so he went into the computer room and I kind of looked at the principal and I said, he's really agitated. Do you think he could do some damage in the computer room? And the principal said, no, I have confidence in him. He won't. But what really, really moved me was that the behavior technician actually went to get Jason's blankie. And remember, he's about 9 years old. But he had been so distressed in earlier days, he had brought his blankie with him or something, and a comfort item with him. And so they knew they couldn't talk to him. So they just put it on the door handle and they said, your blankie is there if you need it. Go ahead and open the door. You take it when you're ready. And then walked away with, loud steps so Jason could hear that there was nobody outside the door. And then we heard the door open and the door close. The plan for Jason had already been put into place, but that day was like he was over the top. They already had a place that he could go when things were too much for him. It was actually under the stairs where there were pillows and a curtain, but a curtain, I don't think he felt safe enough behind a curtain. He needed a door. And the adults, I said to them, all you need to do is just let him know it's okay. There was a lot of scary stuff going on today. There was a lot of stuff going on in your world. Everyone would be upset when that happened. So again, we have a page. that helps you to walk around walk around this particular problem, this particular set of emotions that are there, and find ways within the classroom and within the school to help a child who is like that. Third one I'm going to look at is understanding resistance and opposition. What's really going on here? And here's my case study. Carrie had significant behavior problems, so much so that she was in a behavior class. She lived with her mother and father and little brother. Her mother worked at a demanding job and had a home business that kept her busy in the evenings and on the weekend. Her father told me that he had difficulty managing his reactions to Carrie's behavior, and so he often withdrew, even on the weekends. He couldn't spend a lot of time with her. As a result, she spent most of the time on her bicycle, roaming around the neighborhood and being with older girls. She was very oppositional. When the teacher greeted her warmly at the beginning of the day, she would just lash out and say, "No, I hate you. This is stupid." And the situation that occurred was when the class was baking cookies, the teacher asked the children, she allowed the children to taste the dough with popsicle sticks. And she said to them, "Now remember, children, don't break the popsicle stick." And as soon as the teacher said that, I wasn't there and observing it, but I was told afterwards, Carrie just looked up at the teacher and broke the popsicle stick. Now, why would that happen? Well, one of the things we need to remember is that we have a very strong instinct called the counterwill instinct. It's an instinct where we really don't like other people pushing us around. It's a defensive reaction to perceived control or coercion. And none of us likes to be pushed around. We don't like to be hurried when we're already hurrying as fast as we can. And we have to remember that counterwill is not a learned response, but an emotional reaction based in instinct. It just rears its head. Many of us know that, but we've learned how to control it. If someone tries to tell us too much what to do, we often will say to them, "Thanks for the advice. I'll do it my own way," right? That's our counterwill instinct. And it's a very good instinct because it allows us to be who we are, but it also prevents other people from pushing us around too much. It serves to to protect us. It serves our defenses when a student feels too vulnerable. And so they push the adult away and they refuse to do work that would show vulnerability or inadequacy. It's when the student is in alpha mode and wants to be the one in charge and decide for him or herself. These kind of children often have felt that nobody was taking care of them. They have to take care of themselves and they don't want anyone to tell them what to do. Sometimes it comes about when a student is attached to their peers and not attached to the adults. And so they'll listen to what their peers are doing, but they won't listen to what adults are doing. And for some children, counterwill kicks in because of their oversensitivity. The environment is overwhelming, there's sensory overload, and they push back at any requests. The children that we're most familiar with this are children that either have um, uh, sensory integration problems and are children who are on the autism spectrum that we know have huge hypersensitivities. And we know that children on the autism spectrum really don't, will tell us when they're overloaded. Just want to alert you as well that in these pandemic times, there is a lot of counterwill there, but it's being kept at bay by alarm. We want to stay safe. So children will comply and do the things that they need to do. But the trouble is that when there are too many have tos, that's when our counterwill kicks in and there'll be pushback somewhere else. And if you've noticed in your classrooms right now that your children don't really always want to do the work that you ask them to do, or they actually flat out refuse to do work, or they don't follow directions in the way that's expected, or they can't seem to handle transitions, or they do the opposite of what we want, or even being unmotivated and lethargic. This is all counterwill basically saying, "Don't push me around so much." And we actually, sometimes need to tell children, we understand there's a lot of have tos right now. So let's see what we can do with our little guy who broke the popsicle stick, what seems like on purpose. So when did it happen? At baking time. In the classroom with the teacher. None of those things should be a problem. But there was a need to be patient before they could taste the dough. So already there were some parameters being put on. But we also have to remember that he'd been pretty grumpy all day. So there's something going on emotionally for him. And counterwill, of course, there's also frustration, there's also alarm, there's lots of other things there as well. And the trigger was the words, "Don't break the popsicle stick." Now, counterwill is not at all reasonable, rational thinking forward. It was basically, and it's so sad because Carrie lost her opportunity to taste the dough. The brain basically said, "You can't tell me what to do." And that's why looked at the teacher and broke the popsicle stick right looking at the teacher. But now we know for this little girl that this is a little girl whose parents are incredibly absent in her life. She has had to take care of herself. And basically, this is what her brain is doing. And I remember when the staff at the Nest program came and talked to me about this, I said, "Oh my goodness, poor kid." She basically is her counterwill is making her her own worst enemy. And it's not about being rude. It's not about listening to what people say. It's not about being oppositional. It's about being overwhelmed by this instinct. And what we need to do is help her to manage a world that seems to be too much. Again, consequences and time out just confirm to the child that adults don't understand that my world is not manageable. And usually these kinds of kids hate incentives because again, you're trying to buy my good behavior. They will actually say that. And so we need to find ways to avoid these kind of power struggles while still staying in charge. And these children are very challenging. So again, what did the teacher do? Well, it wasn't just the teacher, because at that moment in time, she kind of had to send Carrie away from the group. She had to let the other kids know, because she had said one thing and there was a behavior, and so she had to let the whole group know that this wasn't the way I want you to be acting. But that technician went immediately over to speak to her, not to ask her why she did it, not to tell her that she had done it wrong, not to reinforce that she wasn't going to get any cookie dough, but just to notice that this had happened and that it was a shame, and to let her know sometimes we do things without meaning to. If I had been there, I'm sure I would have seen Carrie looking up like with kind of like, what did I just do? She didn't even know that her will instinct was that strong. And honestly, after the other kids had gone away, I would have probably saved a little bit of cookie dough and just given her a little bit, because we aren't going to cure this by giving her more consequences. This is an instinct she's having a really hard time managing. And what we talked about with the staff, again, because this is a very challenging little girl, continually reminding themselves that Carrie needed to take care of herself and to give her the time and space to respond to a request. The counterwill instinct will go down if there's a little bit of space. When she says no, to recognize it as a way of managing an unpredictable and an unsafe world. Don't take a no at face value. These are the kinds of kids that sometimes if you say to them, "Oh, do you want to come and paint with me?" No. It's not about not wanting to go and paint. It's about just managing a world. And I was another little guy that we had done that exactly, said to him, "Do you want to come and paint with us?" No. And luckily the adult and I, first of all, we didn't react to the way in which he said no, which was not very polite. I said, "Let's just walk away." And we just started, doing other things. And bit by bit, he came close to us and he says, "Can I paint now?" "Absolutely, honey, you can paint now." We recognized his counterwill instinct as a protective mechanism and not as rude behavior. And again, we have a whole page on that. And we've also created a page on sensory issues and sensitivity as well, to help you create an environment for those kind of children. And many of you do know how to do that. Okay, so the last little thing I want to get to is the maturation issue, the immature brain. What we know is that when the brain is immature, okay, it's really hard for the brain to manage strong emotions and make good decisions, because it's not yet ready to find information efficiently, because the cerebellum is not yet well developed. And remember, the brain takes well into the mid-20s to fully develop. The cerebellum is one of those parts that doesn't fully develop till 25. Seeing the whole picture, the corpus callosum that connects the left brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, it's underdeveloped. So, looking at a piece of the puzzle and then looking at the whole puzzle, the brain isn't very good at doing that. And then tempering that emotional reaction that comes with the prefrontal cortex. I get really frustrated with my teacher, but if I say no in a rude way, then she's not going to let me do something. That prefrontal cortex isn't there yet to be able to have, on the one hand, on the other hand kind of thoughts. And so as a result, these children often know better, but they cannot do better because emotion overwhelms reason. Behavior will improve as the maturation occurs, but this takes time. With vulnerability, again, we need to realize that growth requires softness. The brain senses it's too vulnerable, it protects itself. When it is protecting itself, it's not growing. And this is what we've seen with children who've had adverse childhood experiences, complex trauma. And what we now know about their brains is not only is the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the corpus callosum and the cerebellum not developing, they also have a kindled amygdala, which results in more intense emotional reactions. So the part of the brain that can modulate the emotions is not developing, and the amygdala is actually overreactive. And so what we have here is a kindled amygdala where emotions are intensely activated. And the part of the brain that's supposed to regulate the emotions is diminished, the reasonable part of the brain, because the prefrontal cortex and the corpus callosum are not functioning. And we call this the double invisible handicap. These children look normal. They can talk, they can tell us what they should do, but in the moment, they are completely overwhelmed by this double handicap that they have. And the only way we can work around that is by understanding what they're experiencing and giving time and space for the brain to develop. And we need to remember around learning, when survival is at stake, especially facing separation, all our arousal and attention systems are highly involved. Alarm is given the high priority, emotions are activated. We now have to pay attention to what's threatening us and what could save us. And as a result, this affects the student's ability to learn new material, to retain or remember what they've learned, and to apply what they know. The brain can only apply what it knows when it is calm and rested. An activated, agitated brain can't do that very well. And so for them, doing schoolwork is hard and exhausting. And many of them have worked harder than other students and actually produce less, but they've worked really hard. And then when they're told to make up the work at breaks or for homework, they become discouraged or frustrated. So again, we come back. When the flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment, not the flower. Our basic intervention principles are: go back to the beginning, go back to the attachment, preserve and maximize that attachment relationship. Respect and compensate for the level of immaturity. How can I help this child stay out of trouble? How can I protect their vulnerability so eventually they can get back to their feelings and get back to the sadness that many of them carry inside of their hearts? And come alongside their emotional experience by allowing emotional expressions and encouraging play. And again, our presentation that I did a couple of months ago on managing behavior without rewards actually goes through a lot of these kinds of interventions. The gardener does not make the plant grow. The job of the gardener is to create the optimal conditions. And so, as you know, we have a website, and particularly the members part of the website, where you can find all of these challenges, where you can go and find all of the resources that I suggested to you here. And I just wish you all the best, and I hope that this has helped you to get a sense of what is happening with the children in your care, who sometimes challenge us with their behaviors, but who really challenge us to find ways in which best to help them. Catherine, I don't know if you want to add a couple of words here. I'm nearly at the end of our time, but
it was great, Eva. I mean, just the way that you've illustrated, sometimes it really helps to see it, unfold in action. So no, it was really, really great. In terms of the website, I did put into the chat the address with the password. It's also there in the handout. So yeah, I mean, we've got so much material. I mean, please know, Eva and I and Martine took days and weeks to try to flesh out and making it more simple because we had so much material at first. And the idea of this presentation today was really to kind of give an overview to general student challenges, and to get into the nitty gritty of every single type. We do have a section allocated for that, as Eva mentioned throughout the presentation.
Great. And just before, I know some people might have to leave, Catherine, if you could just post the link to the evaluation
Absolutely.
of the session today,
Yes.
which we are trying to keep track of and appreciate your feedback and input.
Here
I
we go.
know that we don't have a lot of time for questions today, but maybe if someone has one that they would like to share with us, we could maybe have a couple of minutes to respond. I noticed a few things in the chat, but I didn't notice any.
No, it was more at the beginning, and I answered those questions.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm. So please, if you have a few moments to go and fill out the survey, that would be really appreciated. If not, Eva, if you wouldn't mind copying down at least the link, or Eva will email it to you when she sends the recording. Yes, very much appreciated.
And we have a session. Please go to our website. I forgot to put, I usually put a slide with the next session on it, but I forgot this time. Just go to our website. All of our sessions are advertised there. If you're listening to this on the recording, a lot later, you could go back and find all the recordings of the sessions that you may have missed. But we just encourage you to, especially in this, we know that it is difficult for you right now. Many of you are exhausted, but maybe just seeing a behavior with your heart, and in that way just might help you get through the day. And the other big thing that when we look at a developmental approach is we don't need to fix every behavior every time. There is time for behavior to change as children grow, as they develop, as they become more confident with us. The developmental approach is really a hopeful approach, and it allows us to just take the time. I guess we could stop the recording here, Catherine.
Yep.